In a turbulent period lasting over 4 years, the American auto industry faced one of its most dramatic shake-ups. Ford Motor Company's CEO, Jim Farley, took a rare stance by publicly criticizing President Donald Trump's sweeping tariff policy, a move that set him apart from much of corporate America. Speaking shortly after Beijing issued a sharp response, Farley warned of the looming economic toll, thousands of jobs in jeopardy, supply chains in disarray, and rising panic across the industry. But perhaps what captured even more media attention was Trump's explosive response, filled with fiery predictions and unapologetic nationalism. His message was unambiguous: build American, build here, or pay the price. In early 2025, Trump announced a bold 25% tariff on all imported vehicles and auto parts. Far from a minor tweak, it was a seismic policy change intended to revive U.S. manufacturing, bring back lost jobs, and reignite national pride in Made in the USA. While the intent resonated with patriotic ideals, the reality was far more complex. After decades of building deeply integrated international supply chains, the American auto industry found itself vulnerable. The sudden policy shift triggered disruptions that no one had fully anticipated. Ford, long considered a pillar of American automotive strength, was hit hard. Major plants in Chicago and Michigan went silent, halting production of key models like the Explorer, Aviator, Bronco, and Ranger. The shutdowns displaced thousands of workers, leaving their futures uncertain and their communities shaken. These were not just production delays, they were crushing financial blows. Ford projected losses of $1.5 billion in 2025 alone, driven by frozen supply chains and suspended operations. And Ford was not alone. General Motors laid off 750 workers at its Oshawa plant in Canada, sending economic shockwaves through the region. Stellantis, the parent company of Chrysler and Dodge, temporarily laid off 900 workers in the US and paused production in both Mexico and Canada. The cross-border chaos revealed the tightly woven fabric of North America's automotive ecosystem, one that couldn't easily absorb such a dramatic shift. Suppliers across the continent, from those producing tiny fasteners to advanced electronic systems, were squeezed as orders vanished. With production halted or scaled back, many of these businesses had to reduce their workforce or confront financial collapse. The ripple effects were devastating, affecting not just automakers, but thousands of smaller companies and the communities that depended on them. What began as a political maneuver to protect American jobs quickly evolved into a high-stakes balancing act. While the tariffs were designed to promote domestic industry, they laid bare the fragile complexity of global manufacturing. The interconnected supply networks, built over decades, couldn't be untangled overnight without immense cost and disruption. This raised a pivotal question: would this economic upheaval spark a renaissance in U.S. manufacturing, or would it deepen the wounds and drive prices higher for everyday consumers? Automakers scrambled to adapt, reassessing production strategies, looking to localize operations, and bracing for rising costs amid market uncertainty. Communities across North America watched with bated breath, wondering whether the industry could weather the storm or if this moment would fundamentally reshape the automotive landscape. As the dust settled, it became clear that the American auto sector stood at a defining crossroads, forced to reconcile with its past and urgently reimagine its future. The future of the American auto industry now hinges on resilience, innovation, and strategic adaptability, traits that will ultimately determine which companies survive and which ones falter. The 25% tariff introduced by President Donald Trump wasn't just a trade policy, it was a jarring wake-up call. It laid bare the vulnerabilities lurking beneath the gleaming surface of America's automotive powerhouses. Long-held assumptions were shattered, lives were upended, and the industry was thrust toward an uncertain and volatile future. The path to reviving U.S. auto manufacturing had begun, not with careful planning, but with a sudden and forceful shock that few were prepared for. As automakers scrambled to respond to the economic upheaval caused by the tariffs, the cost of producing vehicles skyrocketed. From supply chain disruptions to increased material costs, companies faced an unprecedented financial squeeze that threatened both their profits and their ability to remain competitive. In an effort to counteract these pressures and retain customer interest, companies rolled out a series of bold strategies. Ford, for instance, made headlines by offering employee pricing to all consumers, not just their own staff. This unusual move gave the general public access to significant discounts typically reserved for employees, in hopes of offsetting price hikes and maintaining sales momentum. But the challenges ran deeper. Some of Ford's most popular models, such as the Mustang Mach-E, Maverick, and Bronco Sport, are built in Mexico. The newly imposed tariffs on Mexican imports forced Ford to raise the prices of these vehicles by nearly $2,000. While this helped cover the additional costs, it made the cars less attractive in a fiercely competitive market. The company also had to make tough calls elsewhere. The Lincoln Nautilus, a luxury SUV imported from China, became too expensive to sell in the US market. Ford ultimately decided to cease exports of the Nautilus to China altogether, an eye-opening sign of how global trade tensions and rising costs were redrawing the industry's boundaries. General Motors, GM, faced its own series of painful adjustments. The company re-evaluated its production footprint, making the difficult decision to lay off hundreds of workers and shift some truck manufacturing back to Indiana from other regions. These measures were intended to streamline operations and reduce costs, but they also brought hardship to workers and communities that depended on those jobs. The entire automotive sector felt the weight of these transformations. In just 1 month, the average price of new vehicles surged by more than 2.5%, the sharpest increase in years. Dealerships across the country found their lots eerily empty as production delays and shipping setbacks made once readily available cars and trucks rare commodities. Frustrated customers faced longer wait times and fewer choices, while sales teams struggled to meet demand amid shrinking inventories. Behind the scenes, automakers wrestled with impossible decisions: should they raise prices further and risk losing customers, or cut costs at the expense of quality and jobs? Each option came with significant risk. Meanwhile, supply chain disruptions, from missing parts to delayed shipments, added layers of complexity to an already strained industry. For everyday consumers, this meant paying more for fewer options. For workers, it meant job insecurity, unpredictable hours, and deep anxiety about the future. And for automakers, it was a test of survival in a world where economic policies, global trade dynamics, and consumer behaviors were changing at breakneck speed. In essence, the U.S. auto industry found itself at a pivotal crossroads, caught between rising costs, mounting global pressures, and an urgent need to innovate. How companies choose to navigate this difficult road ahead will not only redefine the car buying experience, but also reshape the lives of millions who depend on this critical industry. While President Trump's push for vehicles to be built in America sounds appealing, the reality is far more complicated than it appears. The next step is to explore why this approach, however well-intentioned, may not be as feasible as it seems. Trump's tariff trap. President Donald Trump has delivered a blunt message to automakers: if they want to avoid hefty tariffs, they simply need to bring their factories and production lines back to the United States. On the surface, it sounds like a straightforward fix, but the reality is far more complicated. The auto industry now finds itself bracing for impact as a series of tariffs, some already in effect, others still looming, threaten to drive up the cost of both manufacturing and purchasing vehicles. These aggressive trade policies could add thousands of dollars to the price of a new car while shaking the foundations of the global supply chain that underpins the modern automotive industry. The current wave of disruption began with Trump's decision to impose a 25% tariff on imported steel and aluminum, materials that are vital to car manufacturing. That policy took effect this week, triggering immediate concern. Next in line are proposed tariffs targeting vehicles imported from Europe and Asia, set to roll out in the coming month. Meanwhile, tariffs on goods, including cars and auto parts, from Canada and Mexico have been hanging in the balance for years, constantly threatened, delayed, withdrawn, and revived. As of now, they're scheduled to take effect in April, adding yet another layer of uncertainty. Automakers are scrambling to respond, but the reality is that car manufacturing cannot be relocated overnight. Establishing new production facilities in the U.S. requires billions in investment, years of planning, and the coordination of thousands of jobs. These vehicles are built using supply chains that stretch across continents, where parts are designed and manufactured in different countries before final assembly in the US. Dismantling such a vast, intricate system is not a weekend project, it's a colossal undertaking that borders on industrial reconstruction. Despite this complexity, President Trump maintains that the solution is simple: move operations to the United States, and you'll avoid tariffs altogether. Start investing. Shift production here, said White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt earlier this month. Her remarks came just after Trump delayed tariffs on most Canadian and Mexican goods by another month. That's the ultimate goal, she emphasized. Yet for many in the automotive industry, the idea seems not just overly simplistic, it's wildly unrealistic. Constructing a new automotive plant in the US is a time-consuming, resource-heavy process. It involves finding suitable land, navigating zoning and environmental regulations, acquiring permits, hiring and training a workforce, and establishing infrastructure. Even after those hurdles are cleared, production doesn't start overnight. Moreover, the cost of operating in the United States, driven by higher wages, land prices, and taxes, is substantially greater than in many foreign locations. Automakers have spent decades optimizing their global operations for efficiency, affordability, and access to talent. Uprooting this finely balanced system isn't a decision CEOs can make on political whims. The global nature of car manufacturing adds another layer of difficulty. A typical vehicle sold in the US might include components from 10 or more countries, engines built in Canada, transmissions from Germany, wiring harnesses from Mexico, and final assembly in an American factory. Relocating all of these elements to a single country would be like asking a spider to rebuild its web overnight, meticulous, delicate, and extremely time-consuming. That's why many automakers and industry experts have pushed back against the administration's approach. They argue that such tariffs won't just impact foreign manufacturers, they'll hurt American workers, raise prices for consumers, and make US automakers less competitive on the global stage. Nevertheless, Trump remains unwavering in his belief that tough trade measures will force companies to reinvest in American manufacturing, creating jobs and revitalizing domestic industry. It's a bold, nationalist vision that resonates with many voters, but it also stands in stark contrast to the complex realities of modern global manufacturing. So, while the notion of just moving production to the US might sound convincing in a campaign speech, executing such a plan in the real world is a logistical challenge of enormous scale, one that could take years and cost billions to bring to life. The real cost of tariffs on the American auto industry. Let's take a closer look at how tariffs are reshaping the American automobile industry, and not for the better. Even if automakers respond by opening new factories in the US or expanding production at existing ones, they still face a major obstacle that can't be solved by simply adding more assembly lines. According to the Anderson Economic Group, a well-regarded Michigan-based research firm, tariffs on imported auto parts could increase the cost of what we typically consider American-made cars by anywhere from $3,000 to $12,000 per vehicle. That's a staggering increase, especially in a market where prices are already near historic highs. These additional costs don't just vanish, they move down the supply chain. First, dealerships absorb the blow, but they quickly pass it on to consumers. The result? Many Americans may find car ownership increasingly unaffordable. For automakers, these price hikes could make producing certain models far less profitable, or in some cases, economically unviable. If the trend continues, we could see fewer cars rolling off the lines, job losses across the industry, and a major slowdown for the suppliers who provide critical parts and materials. For decades, North American automakers operated as if the US, Canada, and Mexico were a single, borderless manufacturing hub. This integration was enabled first by NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and later by its successor, the USMCA, United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which was negotiated during Trump's presidency. Under these trade frameworks, manufacturers have moved parts and components freely across borders, often multiple times, before final assembly. To illustrate the scale of this interdependence, Mexico exports around $82 billion in auto parts to the US annually, most of which are used in American factories. That's nearly 70% more than the total value of completed vehicles Mexico sends directly to US dealerships. Canada also plays a vital role, exporting about $19 billion worth of auto parts to the United States each year. But this exchange is far from one-sided. U.S. parts suppliers, in turn, export $36 billion worth of components to Mexico and another $28 billion to Canada. It's a deeply interconnected system, a continental ecosystem, really, that keeps costs competitive and operations efficient. This is where tariffs pose a real threat. If the cost of shipping parts across borders suddenly spikes due to trade restrictions or duties, the ripple effects could be devastating. Hundreds of thousands of American jobs, especially those tied to parts production, could disappear. What many don't realize is that the term "made in America" rarely means 100% domestic content. Parts often come from Canada or Mexico, even if the final assembly occurs on U.S. soil. In fact, under USMCA rules, parts from Canada and Mexico are counted as a domestic, yet even with that broad definition, no car sold in America is made from more than 75% domestic content. This complex, border-crossing dance of labor and materials has been the backbone of North American automotive success. Tariffs threaten to fracture that system, forcing companies to isolate their operations rather than collaborate. Instead of acting as one integrated market, North America could see its supply chains collapse, factories close, and vehicle prices climb beyond the reach of everyday consumers. The danger here goes beyond just higher sticker prices. These tariffs risk unraveling decades of progress in trade cooperation, manufacturing efficiency, and job growth. Even if automakers ramp up domestic production in the US, those new facilities can't undo the broader economic damage. Costs will still rise, jobs tied to global supply chains will be lost, and American families may soon find that the cars they've long dreamed of are no longer affordable. Ultimately, the true cost of tariffs isn't just measured in dollars. It's measured in lost opportunities, disappearing jobs, and a shaken industry now standing at a crossroads. As the debate continues, it's critical to ask, are these trade policies protecting American industry, or slowly dismantling it from within?